The acrid smoke rose thick and black against the pale morning sky of Rouen, carrying with it the prayers and screams of a 19-year-old girl who would transform the world. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. It was May 30th, 1431, and in the old market square, surrounded by thousands of jeering English soldiers and Norman citizens, Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who had crowned a king and changed the course of history, was about to die. But this is not where her story ends. It is where it truly begins. The executioner Geoffroy Tirage had built the pyre unusually high, so high that he could not reach her to offer the mercy of strangulation before the flames took hold. Whether this was cruelty or cowardice, we shall never know. But as the fire began to lick at her white dress, Joan's clear voice rang out over the crowd. Jesus! Jesus! An English soldier, moved by some inexplicable compassion, fashioned a crude cross from 2 sticks and held it up where she could see it through the smoke. In that moment, watching the flames consume what her enemies believed would be her legacy, few could have imagined that they were witnessing not the end of a story, but the birth of a legend that would outlast kingdoms, inspire revolutions, and challenge our understanding of faith, courage, and the power of one person to change history. This is the story of that girl, not the sanitized saint of later centuries, nor the political symbol appropriated by countless causes, but the real Joan. Complex, fierce, tender, brilliant, and utterly human. It is a story that begins not with divine visions or military triumphs, but in the green valleys of northeastern France, where a peasant girl named Johanna d'Arc would first hear voices that would lead her to save a kingdom and lose her life. The first thing you must understand about Domremy is that it existed in a world perpetually balanced on the edge of destruction. In the early 15th century, this small village, nestled in the valley of the Meuse River, was not merely a collection of stone houses with thatched roofs and small gardens. It was an island of loyalty in an ocean of chaos, a place where French identity persisted, even as the kingdom itself seemed to be dissolving around it. Joan of Arc was born here on January 6th, 1412, the Feast of Epiphany, though she would never call herself by that name. To her neighbors, she was Jehanette. To her family, simply Johanna. The name d'Arc itself remains a mystery that scholars have debated for centuries. Her father's documents show variations: Jacques d'Arc, Jacques d'Arc, Jacques Romay. Apostrophes were not commonly used in the 15th century, and surnames were fluid things, often changing based on the whims of clerks or the circumstances of the moment. What we know with certainty is that she was born into a world at war, in a village that technically should not have existed. The house where Joan drew her first breath still stands today, though much altered by time and the inevitable renovations of later centuries. It was a substantial stone building, larger than the hovels of the truly poor, testament to the fact that Jacques d'Arc was no serf, scraping by on the margins of survival. He owned 50 acres of land, a considerable holding for a peasant, and served as the village doyen, a position of responsibility and respect. The family kept horses, cattle, and a large flock of sheep that grazed in the rich meadows along the Meuse. This prosperity was neither accidental nor secure. The D'Arc family had achieved their position through hard work, shrewd marriages, and the peculiar politics of their borderland location. Domremy sat at the confluence of three different jurisdictions, nominally part of the Duchy of Bar, which owed allegiance to France, but with parts of the village technically belonging to the Bishop of Toul, who was a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, while the lords of Bourlemont held seigneurial rights over the entire area. This tangle of competing loyalties might have been a nightmare for tax collectors, but it offered opportunities for clever peasants to play different authorities against each other. Joan's mother, Isabelle Romay, brought her own mysterious heritage to the marriage. The name Romay traditionally indicated someone who had made a pilgrimage to Rome, though whether Isabelle herself or an ancestor had earned this designation remains unknown. What is clear is that she was a woman of deep faith and considerable strength, qualities she would pass to her daughter, along with an ironclad devotion to Catholic orthodoxy and French loyalty. The household buzzed with activity and voices. Joan had three brothers, Jacquemin, Jean, and Pierre, along with a sister named Catherine. In a world where infant mortality claimed perhaps half of all children before their 5th birthday, the survival of 5 dark children spoke to both good fortune and good care. The family ate well, bread made from wheat rather than the barley and rye of poorer folk, meat several times a week, cheese from their own cattle, eggs from their chickens, and honey from their hives. But comfortable though they were by peasant standards, the Dark family lived their lives under the constant shadow of war. The 100 Years' War had been raging since 1337, though its character had changed dramatically by the time of Joan's birth. What had begun as a feudal dispute over the French succession had evolved into something unprecedented. A conflict that touched every village, every family, every aspect of life in France. By 1412, the war had already lasted 75 years, longer than living memory, longer than recorded history in most villages. It was not so much an event as a condition of existence. The specific horror facing Domremy in Joan's childhood was the civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. This internal French conflict, overlaid upon the broader Anglo-French struggle, had torn the kingdom apart. The Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, had allied himself with England, creating a three-way war that devastated the French countryside. Neither Charles VI of France, who suffered from periodic bouts of madness, nor his feuding nobles could provide effective leadership against the English invaders and their Burgundian allies. For the peasants of Domremy, this meant living in constant fear of raiding parties. The English and their allies practiced what historians delicately call chevauchée, organized destruction designed to impoverish the enemy's territory. Crops were burned, livestock slaughtered or driven off, villages razed, and civilians killed or enslaved. The goal was not merely military, but economic, to make the land worthless to the enemy while enriching oneself with plunder. Joan grew up hearing the church bells ring backward, the signal that raiders were approaching, and everyone must flee to the fortified island castle of Bourlemont, or hide in the forests until danger passed. She learned to read the sky for smoke that might indicate burning villages, to listen for the sound of hooves that could mean death approaching, to sleep lightly so she could wake if her father whispered urgently in the darkness. The psychological effect of this constant threat on a child cannot be overstated. Every peasant family had stories of relatives killed, captured, or simply disappeared. Every village had its burned houses, its empty fields, its population of widows and orphans. The very landscape bore scars, abandoned settlements, overgrown fields reverting to forest, bridges destroyed and never rebuilt. Yet somehow, in this atmosphere of perpetual crisis, Joan's childhood was also filled with beauty, learning, and love. Her mother taught her to sew, spin, and weave, skills every peasant girl required, but which Isabel elevated to an art form. Joan became so accomplished with needle and thread that witnesses at her later trial would comment with amazement on her ability. More importantly, her mother taught her the stories and prayers that would shape her understanding of the world. Every evening, the family gathered for prayers, and Isabel would recount the lives of the saints, the miracles of Jesus, the promise of salvation for the faithful. Joan learned that Saint Michael the Archangel was the protector of France, that Saint Catherine of Alexandria had died rather than renounce her faith, that Saint Margaret had emerged victorious from the belly of a dragon through the power of prayer. These were not abstract theological concepts, but living presences, as real to Joan as the neighbors she saw every day. The church at Domremy contained statues of these saints, and Joan would kneel before them for hours, sometimes weeping with religious fervor. Her father taught her different lessons. Jacques d'Arc was a practical man who understood that survival required both shrewdness and strength. He taught Joan to read the politics of their complex situation, when to bow before the agents of the Duke of Bar, when to appeal to the authority of the Bishop of Toul, when to invoke the protection of their immediate lords, the Bourlemans. He showed her how to judge horseflesh, how to calculate the yield of grain fields, how to negotiate with merchants and officials. Most memoriously, he taught her to ride. This was unusual for a peasant girl, but the Dark family's prosperity depended partly on their horse trading, and Joan showed both aptitude and enthusiasm for equestrian skills. By her early teens, she could mount a horse leapfrog style from behind, a cowgirl trick that astonished her contemporaries. She learned to judge a horse's character, to control a mount with her knees and voice rather than harsh bits, to ride long distances without fatigue. Joan's brothers provided yet another kind of education. They taught her games that were preparation for war: wrestling, swordplay with wooden weapons, archery, and the throwing of knives and stones. Medieval childhood was not protected from violence. Children were expected to grow up tough, ready to defend themselves and their families. Joan proved remarkably gifted at these martial arts, displaying a natural understanding of balance, timing, and tactical thinking that would serve her well in later life. But perhaps the most important aspect of Joan's childhood education came from the landscape itself. Domremy sits in one of the most beautiful valleys in France. The Meuse River winds lazily through rich meadows, flanked by gentle hills covered with oak, beech, and chestnut forests. The air is clean and sweet, filled with the songs of birds and the sound of cattle bells. The light has a particular quality, golden in summer, crystalline in winter, that seems to make every leaf, every stone, every face more vivid than elsewhere. Joan spent her childhood exploring this landscape with an intensity that bordered on mysticism. She knew every path through the forests, every hidden pool along the river, every cave in the limestone hills. She could identify birds by their songs, predict weather from cloud formations, find her way through the darkest nights by reading stars in wind direction. Most significantly, she developed an emotional connection to the land that went far beyond practical knowledge. This was France, not the abstraction that kings and nobles fought over, but the actual soil, the actual trees, the actual streams that nourished her people. When Joan later spoke of her mission to save France, she was not thinking primarily of political boundaries or royal prerogatives, but of places like Domremy, productive, beautiful, beloved, and perpetually threatened by foreign invaders. There was one place in particular that held special meaning for her, an ancient oak tree known as the Arbre des Dames, Ladies' Tree, or sometimes l'Arbre Fées, Fairies' Tree. This massive oak stood in a clearing about a mile from the village, its branches so broad that its shade could shelter 100 people. Local legend held that fairies danced beneath its branches, particularly on certain feast days, and that those pure of heart might sometimes see them. Joan loved this tree with a passion that alarmed her more conventional neighbors. She would spend hours sitting beneath its branches, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, weaving flower crowns and singing old songs. She decorated the tree with ribbons and small offerings, as was customary, and defended it fiercely when some suggested it should be cut down as a possible site of pagan practices. What Joan experienced beneath this tree would become one of the most contentious aspects of her later trial. Her enemies claimed she had made pacts with demons there. Her supporters insisted she had received holy visions. The truth, as is so often the case with Joan, was probably both more complex and more simple than either extreme. She was a girl of extraordinary sensitivity, growing up in a place and time of extraordinary stress. The combination of deep religious faith, constant anxiety about war, and the mystical beauty of the Meuse Valley created in her a heightened awareness of what medieval people called the thin places, locations where the barrier between the earthly and divine seemed especially permeable. Whether what she experienced beneath that oak tree was divine intervention, psychological manifestation, or some combination of both, it was real to Joan, and it changed her life forever. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the visions, before the voices, before the great mission that would make her famous, Joan of Arc was simply Jeannette d'Arc, a peasant girl who loved her family, feared for her village, and dreamed of a France at peace. She was 13 years old when everything changed. The summer of 1425 pressed down on Domremy like a weight. The heat shimmered off the stone walls of the houses, and even the Meuse seemed to flow more slowly, its waters warm to the touch and thick with algae. Joan, now 13 and growing into the strong, compact build that would characterize her adult years, found little relief even in the shade of the family garden. She had been working since dawn, as was expected of every member of a peasant household during harvest season. Her mother had set her to weeding the vegetable plots behind their house. Tedious work, made more unpleasant by the oppressive heat and the clouds of insects that rose from the damp earth. Her brothers were in the fields with their father, bringing in the barley crop before the weather could turn. And even her sister Catherine was busy in the house, helping preserve meat and vegetables for the coming winter. It was past noon when Joan finally stood up from her weeding, brushing the dirt from her knees and pushing a strand of dark hair from her face. Her back ached, her hands were stained green with plant juices, and she was desperately thirsty. She was reaching for the water jug her mother had left under the pear tree when the world changed forever. Later, when interrogators demanded precise details about her first vision, Joan would struggle to find words adequate to describe what she experienced in that moment. How do you explain to skeptical clerics that you have seen the impossible? How do you convey the overwhelming reality of the divine breaking through the ordinary world of gardens and weeding and summer heat? "I was in my father's garden," she would testify during her trial, "and I saw light coming from the right side, from the direction of the church, and rarely did I see it without also hearing a voice." But this clinical description captures nothing of the actual experience. What Joan saw was not merely light, but presence, a radiance that seemed to contain intelligence, personality, infinite compassion. What she heard was not merely sound, but communication that bypassed her ears entirely, speaking directly to her soul in words that were somehow familiar, though she had never heard them before. The voice told her to be good, to go to church often, to live piously, and serve God. Simple instructions, hardly revolutionary, the kind of thing any priest might say to a young parishioner. Yet the manner of their delivery transformed these commonplace admonitions into something that would redirect the course of European history. Joan collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by terror and wonder in equal measure. Every story her mother had told her about saints and angels suddenly became vividly, impossibly real. The divine realm was not a distant concept from sermons and prayers, but an immediate presence surrounding her, pressing in on her ordinary life with irresistible authority. The vision lasted only moments, but its effects would endure for the rest of her life. When the light faded and the voice fell silent, Joan remained on her knees in the garden, shaking with a mixture of fear and exaltation. She understood, with absolute certainty, that nothing would ever be the same. Over the following weeks and months, the visions returned with increasing frequency and clarity. At first, they came only when Joan was alone, usually during her daily tasks of tending animals or working in the fields. Gradually, she learned to recognize the signs of their approach. A particular quality of light, a sudden hush in the natural sounds around her, a sense of anticipation that seemed to charge the very air. The voice identified itself as Saint Michael the Archangel, and soon other voices joined his: Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch, the two female saints whose statues Joan had prayed before since childhood. These were not abstract theological presences, but vivid, personal beings with distinct personalities and appearances. Saint Michael appeared to her as a good-looking gentleman surrounded by angels, brilliant and authoritative, the warrior protector of France. Saint Catherine was gentle but strong, the learned princess who had confounded the philosophers of Alexandria with her wisdom before dying for her faith. Saint Margaret, meanwhile, embodied courage in the face of persecution, the young martyr who had triumphed over a dragon through the power of prayer. What made these visions particularly remarkable was their sensory completeness. Joan did not merely see and hear her saints. She could touch them, embracing Saints Catherine and Margaret, and marveling that they smelled wonderful. The visions engaged all her senses, creating experiences so vivid that she never doubted their objective reality. The saint's messages evolved gradually from general spiritual guidance to specific political instruction. Initially, they simply encouraged Joan to live piously and attend to church regularly. But as the months passed, their communications became more urgent and detailed. They spoke of the suffering of France, of the rightful king denied his crown, of the need for divine intervention to save the realm from destruction. The political situation that prompted these increasingly urgent messages was indeed desperate. In 1424, the year before Joan's visions began, French forces had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Verneuil. This victory left English armies dominant across northern France and their Burgundian allies, controlling much of the east. The Dauphin Charles, the uncrowned heir to the French throne, held only a fragment of his patrimony, governing from Bourges, while his enemies occupied Paris and most of the great cities of the realm. For the peasants of places like Domremy, this political crisis translated into daily terror. Raiding parties swept through the countryside with increasing frequency, and the normal protections of feudal society, the obligation of lords to defend their vassals, had largely collapsed. Joan's own family experienced this firsthand in 1428, when Burgundian forces raided Domremy, driving the inhabitants to flee to the fortified town of Neufchâteau. It was in this context of escalating crisis that Joan's visions began to focus on a specific mission. Her saints told her that she must go to the Dauphin Charles and convince him to allow her to raise the siege of Orléans, the last major French stronghold blocking English control of the Loire Valley. They promised that if she could accomplish this task, the way would be clear for Charles to be crowned king at Reims Cathedral, the traditional site of French royal consecrations. To understand how extraordinary these instructions were, one must appreciate Joan's position in medieval society. She was a peasant girl, barely into her teens, living in a world where social hierarchy was considered divinely ordained. The idea that such a person could approach the heir to the throne, much less offer him military advice, was so far outside normal expectations as to be almost unthinkable. Moreover, the military mission her voices described required not just social transgression, but gender transgression of the most dramatic kind. Medieval women, regardless of their social rank, were expected to be passive in matters of war. They might defend their homes if absolutely necessary, but the idea of a woman leading armies and offensive campaigns violated fundamental assumptions about the nature of female virtue and social order. Joan understood these difficulties perfectly well. She was not the naive farm girl of popular imagination, but a clever young woman who had grown up observing the complex politics of her borderland region. She knew that what her voices asked of her would expose her to ridicule, rejection, and potentially lethal accusations of witchcraft or heresy. Yet the visions continued with increasing intensity and specificity. The saint showed her details of the siege of Orléans, described the political situation at the Dauphin's court, even provided information about secret prayers and conversations that she could use to prove her divine mission. They also began to prepare her for the personal costs of her calling, warning her that she would be captured and executed before her 20th birthday. Joan's response to these revelations reveals both her extraordinary character and the depth of her faith. Rather than flee from her destined martyrdom, she embraced it as the necessary price of serving God and France. Since God commanded it, she would later say, Had I had 100 fathers and 100 mothers, and had I been a king's daughter, I would have gone. But accepting her mission intellectually was one thing. Acting on it was quite another. For nearly 4 years, from her first vision in 1425 until her departure for the Dauphin's court in 1429, Joan struggled with doubt, fear, and the monumental practical difficulties of fulfilling her calling. During this period, she continued to live the normal life of a peasant girl while secretly preparing for her great mission. She became even more devout than before, spending hours in prayer and attending Mass daily when possible. She also began to develop the military and political knowledge she would need, listening carefully to the conversations of soldiers and merchants who passed through Domremy, and studying the personalities and motivations of local nobles and officials. Perhaps most importantly, she learned to manage her visions and use them strategically. The saints appeared to her regularly, sometimes several times a day, and she discovered that she could summon them at will during times of crisis or decision. This ability to communicate with the divine realm gave her access to information and insights that would prove crucial in her later career. One story from this period illustrates both Joan's growing confidence and her shrewd understanding of how to use her supernatural gifts. A young man named Durand-Lessois, who was married to one of her cousins, came to visit Domremy and mentioned in conversation that his wife was pregnant and fearful about the birth. Joan immediately told him not to worry, that the saints had informed her the child would be born safely and would be a boy. When this prediction proved accurate, word of Joan's prophetic abilities began to spread among her extended family and their connections. This incident shows Joan learning to leverage her visions for practical purposes, while also building the reputation she would need to convince others of her divine mission. She was not simply a passive recipient of supernatural messages, but an active participant in her own legend-making. As her confidence grew, Joan began to reveal aspects of her calling to carefully chosen confidants. She spoke first to Durand-Lessois, who proved sympathetic and would eventually play a crucial role in her journey to the Dauphin's court. She also confided in a local priest, though she was careful not to reveal the full scope of her mission until she was certain of his discretion. The reaction of her family to these revelations was mixed. Her mother, Isabel, was torn between pride in her daughter's apparent sanctity and terror at the dangers such a calling would bring. Medieval mothers understood all too well what happened to young women who claimed divine visions. They were often accused of witchcraft, subjected to humiliating examinations, and sometimes executed as heretics. Her father, Jacques, was even more alarmed. A practical man with a deep understanding of political realities, he recognized immediately that Joan's mission would bring disaster to the entire family. Peasants who attracted the attention of nobles rarely benefited from the experience, and a peasant family whose daughter presumed to advise kings could expect nothing but catastrophe. Jacques' concerns were not merely selfish. He had recurring dreams in which he saw Joan departing with soldiers, and these nightmares convinced him that his daughter was destined for a terrible fate. He even threatened to drown her himself, rather than see her leave Domremy to pursue her visions. At one point, he arranged for her to be engaged to a local young man, hoping that marriage would cure her of her mystical obsessions. This engagement created one of the few documented instances of Joan asserting herself against her family's wishes before her departure for court. When the young man attempted to force the marriage by appealing to church authorities, Joan appeared before the magistrates of Toul to contest the arrangement. She argued successfully that she had never consented to the engagement and could not be compelled to marry against her will. This legal victory demonstrated both her intelligence and her determination to control her own destiny. Meanwhile, the political situation in France continued to deteriorate. In 1428, English forces began the siege of Orléans, the strategic city whose fall would open the entire Loire Valley to enemy occupation. If Orléans fell, the Dauphin's remaining territory would be cut in half, and his cause would become effectively hopeless. Joan's visions responded to this crisis with increasing urgency. Her saints commanded her to leave Domremy immediately and seek out Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander at Vaucouleurs, who would provide her with an escort to the Dauphin's court. They promised that if she hesitated much longer, it would be too late to save France. The decision to act required enormous courage. Joan was asking her family to let her leave everything she had ever known, to travel hundreds of miles through enemy territory, to approach one of the most powerful nobles in France with a request that would sound like madness to any reasonable person. She was also asking them to accept that their daughter might never return home. Yet somehow, in the winter of 1428, Joan convinced those who loved her most to let her go. The key to her success was Durand Lassois, her cousin's husband, who had already witnessed her prophetic abilities. Joan told them that she needed to visit his family in Buray-le-Petit, a village near Vaucouleurs, in order to help with his wife's latest pregnancy. This provided a plausible excuse for leaving Domremy without arousing suspicion about her true intentions. In January 1429, Joan said goodbye to her parents, her siblings, her friends, and the village that had shaped her. She told none of them, except perhaps her mother, that she did not expect to see them again. Instead, she spoke vaguely of visiting relatives and helping with domestic duties. As she walked out of Domremy toward Bury-le-Petit and her meeting with destiny, Joan carried with her only the clothes on her back and an unshakable faith that God had chosen her to save France. Behind her, she left a family torn between love and terror, a village that would never forget its most famous daughter, and a childhood that had ended the moment she first heard voices in her father's garden. The peasant girl who had tended sheep in the meadows along the Meuse was about to become Joan of Arc, the maid who would crown a king and change the world. To understand the magnitude of what Joan attempted, one must first comprehend the depth of France's agony in 1429. This was not merely a kingdom at war, but a realm in the process of dissolution. A nation whose very concept of itself had been shattered by nearly a century of conflict, internal betrayal, and foreign occupation. The France of Joan's time bore little resemblance to the unified nation-state it would later become. It was instead a patchwork of competing authorities. Royal domains directly controlled by the crown, duchies and counties held by semi-independent nobles, ecclesiastical territories governed by bishops and abbots, and free cities that maintained their own governments under royal charters. The king's actual power extended reliably over perhaps a third of what we now consider French territory, while the rest remained under the control of vassals whose loyalty varied with circumstances and opportunity. This fragmented system had functioned adequately during peacetime, when the king's role was primarily ceremonial and administrative. But the 100 Years' War had exposed its fatal weakness. In times of crisis, there was no mechanism for coordinating resistance to external threats or compelling loyalty from reluctant vassals. When powerful nobles like the Duke of Burgundy chose to ally with England, they could deliver entire regions to the enemy without consulting their subjects or considering the broader interests of the realm. The specific crisis facing France in 1429 had its roots in the madness of King Charles VI. Beginning in 1392, the king had suffered periodic episodes of complete mental breakdown, during which he would fail to recognize his family, attack his servants, and speak incoherently for days or weeks at a time. During his lucid intervals, he functioned normally, but these became shorter and less frequent as he aged. The king's madness created a power vacuum that his relatives rushed to fill. Two main factions emerged: the Armagnacs, led by the king's brother Louis of Orleans, and the Burgundians, led by the king's cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Initially, their conflict centered on control of the royal government and access to the treasury. But personal animosity and political rivalry soon escalated into open warfare. The situation became irreversibly poisonous in 1407 when John the Fearless arranged the assassination of Louis of Orleans. This murder, carried out by hired killers on a Paris street, transformed a political dispute into a blood feud that would last for generations. The Armagnacs, now led by Louis's son Charles of Orleans, and the Gascon noble Bernard of Armagnac, swore vengeance against Burgundy and his followers. The civil war that followed devastated France far more thoroughly than the external conflict with England had done. Both sides hired companies of mercenaries, routiers who terrorized the countryside when not actively campaigning. Cities changed hands repeatedly, their populations subjected to siege, sack, and massacre. The normal mechanisms of justice and administration collapsed in large areas, leaving peasants defenseless against bandits, deserters, and tax collectors whose only authority was force of arms. Into this chaos stepped Henry V of England, one of the most formidable warrior kings in medieval history. Henry recognized that French disunity offered an unprecedented opportunity to revive English claims to the French throne, claims that had been dormant since the failed campaigns of Edward III in the previous century. But where earlier English invasions had been expensive raids seeking plunder and prestige, Henry's campaigns aimed at nothing less than the permanent conquest and occupation of France. The English strategy combined military brilliance with political sophistication. Henry's forces avoided the mistakes that had doomed earlier invasions, maintaining strict discipline, establishing secure supply lines, and systematically conquering territory rather than simply raiding it. More importantly, Henry skillfully exploited French divisions, presenting himself as a legitimate alternative to the feuding Armagnacs and Burgundians. The culmination of this strategy came at the Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415. Henry's army, exhausted by a long march and vastly outnumbered by French forces, should have been annihilated. Instead, superior tactics, disciplined archery, and the chaotic overconfidence of the French nobility produced one of the most complete military disasters in medieval history. Thousands of French nobles died in the mud of Picardy, including many of the kingdom's most experienced military leaders. Agincourt was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological catastrophe that shattered French confidence and convinced many that God had indeed abandoned their cause. The flower of French chivalry had perished in a single afternoon, leaving the kingdom defenseless against systematic English conquest. Henry followed up his victory with methodical campaigns that captured most of Normandy and advanced toward Paris. By 1419, English forces controlled much of northern France, while their Burgundian allies dominated the east. The Armagnac faction, supposedly defending royal authority, held only the center and south of the country, governing from Bourges, because Paris itself had fallen to the Burgundians. The final blow to French resistance came in 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes, one of the most extraordinary documents in European diplomatic history. This agreement, negotiated between Henry V and the Mad King Charles VI, acting under Burgundian influence, essentially dismantled the French monarchy. It declared the Dauphin Charles, the rightful heir to the throne, illegitimate and disinherited, naming Henry V as regent and heir to France. Henry also married Catherine of Valois, Charles VI's daughter, cementing the arrangement with dynastic union. The treaty seemed to offer a solution to France's crisis through English efficiency and Burgundian cooperation. Henry V had demonstrated his ability to govern conquered territories fairly and effectively, and his alliance with Burgundy promised to end the civil war that had torn the kingdom apart. Many French nobles, exhausted by decades of chaos, were willing to accept English rule if it meant peace and prosperity. But the Treaty of Troyes created as many problems as it solved. The Dauphin Charles refused to accept his disinheritance and continued to claim royal authority from his reduced capital at Bourges. This meant that France effectively had two competing governments: the English Regency in Paris and northern France, and the Armagnac administration in the south. Rather than ending the Civil War, the treaty institutionalized it. The death of both Henry V and Charles VI in 1422 further complicated matters. Henry VI, the new English king, was an infant, requiring a regency government to rule in his name. The Duke of Bedford, Henry V's brother, proved a capable regent, but he lacked his brother's personal authority and military genius. Meanwhile, Charles VII, as the Dauphin now styled himself, was a weak and indecisive ruler who inspired little confidence among his supporters. By 1428, when Joan's visions began to focus on her mission to save France, the kingdom's situation had become desperate. English forces controlled most of the north, including Paris, Rouen, and Calais. Their Burgundian allies dominated the east, holding cities like Reims, the traditional coronation site of French kings, Dijon, and Troyes. Charles VII's authority was recognized only in central and southern France, and even there his control was tenuous. The symbolic heart of this crisis was the Siege of Orléans, which began in October 1428. This city, strategically located on the Loire River, was the key to Charles's remaining territory. If it fell to the English, their forces could advance up the Loire Valley, splitting the Armagnac lands in two and possibly forcing Charles's complete surrender. The siege quickly became a test of wills that transcended its purely military significance. For the English, capturing Orléans would demonstrate their ability to complete the conquest of France. For Charles's supporters, holding the city became a matter of survival, both political and psychological. If they could not defend Orléans, how could they hope to liberate Paris or Reims? The military situation at Orléans illustrated both the strengths and weaknesses of late medieval warfare. The English had surrounded the city with a ring of fortified positions called Bastille, connected by earthworks and protected by artillery. This system was strong enough to prevent relief supplies from reaching the city, but not strong enough to take Orléans by direct assault. The result was a slow strangulation that might take years to complete. Inside Orléans, the situation grew desperate as winter turned spring. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread among the crowded population, and morale collapsed as week after week passed without effective relief. The city's commander, Jean Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orléans, sent increasingly urgent appeals to Charles VII for assistance, but the royal army lacked the strength to break the English siege lines. Meanwhile, Charles's court at Chinon sank deeper into defeatism and despair. The king himself, only 26 years old, but already worn down by the burdens of his impossible position, spent his days in prayer and his nights in revelry, seemingly unable to decide whether to fight on or negotiate surrender. His nobles quarreled among themselves, some advocating resistance to the last man, while others quietly opened communications with the English Regency. The psychological atmosphere of Charles's court during this period cannot be understood without reference to medieval concepts of divine judgment. Contemporary people believed that military success or failure reflected God's favor or disfavor toward a particular cause. The long string of English victories, culminating in the siege of Orléans, seemed to many observers clear evidence that heaven supported Henry VI's claim to the French throne. This theological interpretation of political events created a vicious cycle of defeatism. French failures led to doubts about the righteousness of their cause, which in turn undermined morale and contributed to further defeats. Even Charles VII himself seems to have wavered in his conviction that he was truly the legitimate king of France. According to Joan's later testimony, the king had secretly prayed to God that if he was not the rightful heir, he would be allowed to flee to Scotland or Spain rather than continue a hopeless struggle. Religious explanations for France's crisis went beyond simple concepts of divine favor. Many contemporaries interpreted the kingdom's sufferings as punishment for the sins of its rulers and people. The civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians, the murder of Louis of Orléans, the chaos and violence that had consumed the realm for decades. All of this could be seen as evidence of a nation that had fallen away from Christian virtue and divine grace. Some observers went further, suggesting that the end times were approaching and that the collapse of France was part of God's plan for the final judgment of humanity. The plague outbreaks that accompanied the warfare, the famines caused by the destruction of agriculture, the breakdown of law and order in many regions, these seem to fulfill biblical prophecies about the tribulations that would precede Christ's second coming. In this atmosphere of despair and apocalyptic expectation, conventional political and military solutions appeared inadequate. What France needed was not another army or another treaty, but a miracle, divine intervention that would reverse the tide of events and restore the kingdom's fortunes. The idea that God might choose an instrument for such intervention was entirely plausible to medieval minds. Biblical precedent existed in figures like Deborah, who had led Israel against its enemies, and more recent history provided examples of saints who had intervened in worldly affairs to protect Christian peoples. The question was not whether God would eventually act to save France, but when and through whom such intervention would come. Various prophecies circulated throughout the kingdom, promising that deliverance would arrive through a virgin from Lorraine, a maid from the oak forests, or a young woman who would restore the rightful king to his throne. These predictions, originating from sources ranging from learned clerics to village fortune tellers, created a widespread expectation that France's salvation would come through supernatural means. It was into this world of desperation, prophecy, and yearning for divine deliverance that Joan of Arc would soon step, carrying her claims of angelic visions and sacred mission. The kingdom that she encountered was not merely defeated, but spiritually exhausted, not merely occupied, but convinced of its own unworthiness. To restore France, she would need to accomplish something far more difficult than military victory. She would need to restore a nation's faith in itself and in the righteousness of its cause. The magnitude of this challenge becomes clear when we consider the specific obstacles Joan would face. The English had not merely conquered territory. They had systematically dismantled the institutional and psychological foundations of French independence. Their administration was efficient and generally fair, offering stability and prosperity to those who accepted foreign rule. Many French nobles had made their peace with the new order, receiving lands and offices under the English regency. Merchants and craftsmen found that English rule brought access to broader markets and more predictable legal systems. Moreover, the Burgundian alliance with England was not merely opportunistic, but reflected genuine grievances against the Armagnac faction. The murder of John the Fearless in 1419, during a supposed peace negotiation with the Dauphin Charles, had convinced many Burgundians that reconciliation with the French royal house was impossible. Duke Philip the Good, John's successor, was a man of honor who took his father's death seriously and would not easily abandon the English alliance that had provided both security and revenge. The military situation was equally challenging. English forces were not the demoralized occupation troops of later centuries, but professional soldiers led by experienced commanders and supported by advanced artillery. They had adapted their tactics to French conditions, combining the longbow techniques that had proven so effective at Agincourt with innovative siege warfare and disciplined infantry formations. Their commanders, particularly the Duke of Bedford and the Earl of Salisbury, were among the most capable military leaders of their generation. Perhaps most daunting of all was the sheer scale of the territory that would need to be liberated. Even if Charles's forces could somehow break the siege of Orléans and reverse their recent defeats, they would still face the monumental task of reconquering most of northern and eastern France. This would require not just military victories, but a complete transformation of the strategic balance, a revolution in French capabilities that seemed beyond the realm of possibility. Yet it was precisely because the situations appeared so hopeless that it was ripe for the kind of transformation that Joan would bring. Conventional solutions had been tried and had failed. Ordinary leaders had proven inadequate to the crisis. What remained was the possibility that extraordinary circumstances might call forth extraordinary responses, that divine providence might indeed intervene in human affairs through the most unlikely of instruments. The France that awaited Joan's arrival was a kingdom on its knees, but it was also a kingdom ready to believe in miracles. The same desperation that had brought the realm to the edge of collapse had also prepared its people to embrace radical solutions and impossible hopes. They had tried trusting in nobles and kings and generals, only to see their armies defeated and their cities conquered. Perhaps it was time to trust in a peasant girl who claimed to speak with angels. In the winter of 1429, as Joan prepared to leave Domremy for her fateful meeting with Robert de Baudricourt, neither she nor anyone else could have predicted exactly how her intervention would transform the course of events. But the kingdom she set out to save was primed for transformation, ready for a leader who could restore not just military fortune, but spiritual confidence. The stage was set for one of the most extraordinary episodes in human history. The journey from Domremy to Vaucouleurs was only 12 miles, but for Joan it represented the crossing of a threshold from which there could be no return. As she walked beside her cousin, Durand-la-Soie, through the frozen fields of January 1429, she was leaving behind not just her family and village, but her entire identity as a peasant girl named Jeannette. By the time she reached Vaucouleurs, she would be transforming herself into Joan of Arc, the maid sent by God to save France. Vaucouleurs itself was a study in contrasts that perfectly embodied the complexities of France's situation. The town sat on a rocky outcrop above the Meuse Valley, its walls and towers proclaiming its military importance as one of the few remaining strongholds loyal to Charles VII in this contested borderland. Yet within those walls, the population struggled with the same hardships that afflicted French communities everywhere. Food shortages, disrupted trade, the constant anxiety of living under siege mentality. The castle that dominated Vaucouleurs housed Robert de Baudricourt, a man whose character would prove crucial to Joan's success. A minor noble from Champagne, Baudricourt had risen through military service to become one of Charles VII's most trusted garrison commanders. He was intelligent enough to recognize talent when he saw it, practical enough to distinguish between genuine opportunity and dangerous fantasy, and loyal enough to the Armagnac cause to take risks for what he believed was right. But when Joan first appeared at his castle gates in January 1429, Baudricourt's initial reaction was precisely what anyone would have expected: complete dismissal of her claims. Here was a peasant girl, barely 17 years old, demanding an audience with one of the kingdom's most important military commanders. Her story, that she had been sent by saints to save France, sounded like the ravings of a madwoman or the crude deception of a confidence artist. Joan had anticipated this skepticism. Her voices had warned her that Baudricourt would reject her initial approach and that she would need to persist through multiple attempts. She had also prepared carefully for this moment, crafting her presentation to maximize its impact while minimizing the risk of immediate arrest for heresy or fraud. Rather than launching directly into claims about her divine mission, Joan began with more mundane but verifiable predictions. She told Baudricourt that French forces would soon suffer a major defeat near Orléans, giving him specific details about timing and casualties that seemed impossible for a peasant girl to know. She also provided information about political discussions at Charles VII's court that demonstrated knowledge no spy or informant could have accessed. Most importantly, she spoke with an authority and confidence that seemed completely at odds with her humble origins. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, and peasants learned from childhood to approach their social superiors with deference and submissiveness. Joan, by contrast, addressed Baudricourt as an equal, even as a superior, whose authority derived from a higher source than earthly rank. "I have come to you from my lord," she told him, using the formal language of diplomatic protocol, "that you might send word to the Dauphin to hold himself ready, but not to give battle to his enemies, because my lord will give him help after mid-Lent. For my lord wills that the Dauphin be made king, and he will hold the kingdom in despite of his enemies, and I myself will lead him to his anointing." The specificity and boldness of these claims were breathtaking. Joan was not merely offering to help the French cause, but promising to personally lead the Dauphin to his coronation. She was claiming direct communication with God and demanding that one of the kingdom's most important nobles stake his career on her supernatural revelations. Baudricourt's response was predictably negative. He ordered Durand-Lassois to give her a good slapping and take her back to her father. But significantly, he did not have Joan arrested or expelled from the town. Something about her presentation, perhaps the uncanny accuracy of her military predictions or the compelling force of her personality, made him hesitate to dismiss her entirely. Over the following weeks, Joan's presence in Vaucouleurs began to create exactly the kind of stir her voices had predicted. She lodged with Henri and Catherine Leroyer, a wheelwright's family who became early converts to her cause after witnessing her extraordinary piety and evident sincerity. Word of her claims spread throughout the town, attracting curious visitors and generating intense debate about the authenticity of her mission. The breakthrough came when Joan's prediction about the French defeat near Orléans proved accurate. On February 12, 1429, French forces attempting to escort a supply convoy to the besieged city were overwhelmed by English troops at what became known as the Battle of the Herrings. The specific details of this defeat, including casualty figures and the names of commanders killed or captured, matched exactly what Joan had told Baudricourt weeks earlier. This verification of her prophetic abilities transformed the atmosphere around Joan. What had seemed like the fantasies of a deluded girl now appeared as genuine divine revelation. Local clergy began to visit her, subjecting her to careful examination, but finding no evidence of heretical beliefs or demonic influence. Several knights and men-at-arms announced their willingness to escort her to the Dauphin's court. The most significant of these early converts were Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, experienced soldiers who would play crucial roles in Joan's subsequent career. Both men testified later that they had been overwhelmed by Joan's spiritual presence and convinced of the authenticity of her mission. More importantly, their military backgrounds enabled them to appreciate the strategic insights Joan displayed when discussing the war's progress. Jean de Metz described his conversion in terms that capture the extraordinary impact Joan had on those who encountered her during this period. "I asked her if she would not go dressed as she was. She answered that she would gladly take man's dress. Then I gave her the dress and equipment of one of my men. After this, the inhabitants of Vaucouleurs had male clothing made for her, a tunic, hose, leggings, and all things necessary. They also gave her a horse worth about 16 francs. The decision to dress Joan in men's clothing was practically necessary. No woman could travel safely through enemy territory or function in a military environment while wearing female garb. But this seemingly pragmatic choice would later provide her enemies with their most effective weapon against her. As cross-dressing was technically forbidden by church law and could be prosecuted as evidence of heretical beliefs. Joan's adoption of male dress was also symbolically significant in ways that went beyond practical considerations. By abandoning the clothing that marked her gender and social status, she was publicly declaring her transformation from peasant girl to divinely appointed messenger. The change in costume represented a change in identity that would prove irreversible. Meanwhile, Baudricourt continued to wrestle with the decision of whether to send Joan to court. The potential rewards of supporting a genuine divine messenger were enormous. He would become known as the man who had recognized God's chosen instrument for saving France. But the risks were equally substantial. If Joan proved to be a fraud or heretic, his career would be ruined, and his loyalty to Charles VII called into question. The commander resolved his dilemma by consulting with local clergy and conducting his own investigation of Joan's background and character. He sent agents to Domremy to gather information about her family, her childhood, and any previous signs of supernatural abilities. The reports they brought back were uniformly positive. Joan came from a respectable family, had shown extraordinary piety from an early age, and had no history of heretical beliefs or suspicious activities. More significantly, Baudricourt arranged for Joan to be examined by a priest to determine whether her visions came from divine or demonic sources. This examination, conducted according to established church procedures, involved extensive questioning about the content and character of her supernatural experiences. Joan's responses apparently satisfied the examining priest that her visions were consistent with Orthodox Christian belief and bore none of the characteristics associated with diabolic influence. The final factor in Baudricourt's decision was political necessity. By February 1429, the siege of Orléans had reached a critical stage, and Charles VII's cause appeared hopeless without some form of extraordinary intervention. Conventional military solutions had been tried and had failed. Diplomatic initiatives had produced nothing but humiliating compromises. What remained was the possibility that God might indeed choose to save France through miraculous means. From this perspective, Joan represented not just an opportunity, but perhaps the only remaining chance for Armagnac's survival. Even if the probability of her success was low, the consequences of failure were so catastrophic that any hope was worth pursuing. As Baudricourt himself later expressed it, he had nothing left to lose, and potentially everything to gain. On February 23, 1429, Baudricourt finally gave Joan the authorization and escort she had been seeking. He provided her with a horse, a small military retinue led by Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, and most importantly, letters of introduction to Charles VII that would guarantee her an audience at court. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon covered nearly 400 miles through territory largely controlled by English forces and their Burgundian allies. It was an expedition that would have challenged experienced soldiers, much less a peasant girl who had never traveled more than a few miles from her home village. The roads were patrolled by enemy troops, infested with bandits, and blocked by rivers where bridges had been destroyed by military action. Joan's small party traveled primarily at night, hiding during daylight hours and avoiding main roads whenever possible. They crossed the Loire River at a dangerous ford, skirted hostile towns, and pushed their horses to the limit of endurance in their effort to reach Chinon quickly. The journey took 11 days, an impressive feat of endurance and navigation that demonstrated both Joan's physical toughness and her companions' skill as guides. More remarkably, Joan maintained her spiritual discipline throughout this grueling journey. She attended Mass daily whenever possible, insisted on proper confession before entering dangerous territory, and spent hours each evening in prayer despite her exhaustion from travel. Her companions later testified that her devotion never flagged and that she seemed to draw strength from her religious observances rather than being weakened by them. The party also maintained strict military discipline during the journey. Joan slept fully clothed and armored, refused to remove her male dress even for sleeping, and kept her weapons close at hand throughout the expedition. This was partly necessary for practical security, but it also reflected her understanding that she was no longer a civilian, but a soldier in God's army. On March 4th, 1429, Joan and her companions finally reached Chinon, the temporary capital of Charles VII's much-reduced kingdom. The town itself reflected the diminished state of the Armagnac cause. Instead of the magnificent palaces and bustling courts of peacetime, Chinon offered only a modest castle perched above the Vienne River, housing a government in exile that controlled perhaps a third of what had once been the greatest kingdom in Christendom. But Joan had not come to admire royal splendor or to commiserate about reduced circumstances. She had come to fulfill the mission her voices had given her, to convince Charles VII to allow her to raise the siege of Orléans and to restore him to his rightful throne. Whether a peasant girl from Domremy could accomplish what the greatest nobles and most experienced generals of France had failed to achieve remained to be seen. What was certain was that Joan of Arc had successfully completed the first phase of her impossible quest. Through a combination of supernatural revelation, personal charisma, and sheer determination, she had transformed herself from an unknown village girl into a figure of national significance. She had convinced skeptical nobles of her divine mission, survived a dangerous journey through enemy territory, and secured an audience with the uncrowned King of France. The easy part was over. Now the real test would begin. The great hall of Chinon Castle had witnessed many moments of French history, but nothing quite like the scene that unfolded on the evening of March 8, 1429. Charles VII, the uncrowned Dauphin of France, had decided to test the peasant girl who claimed to bring him messages from God by concealing himself among the 300 courtiers who packed the chamber. If Joan truly possessed divine guidance, surely she would be able to identify him despite his disguise. Joan entered the hall, wearing the male attire that had now become her signature. A gray tunic, black hose, and soft boots that allowed her to move with the quiet confidence of a trained soldier. Her dark hair was cropped short in the style of a young man, and she carried herself with an authority that seemed to radiate from some inner source of certainty. As she walked through the crowd of richly dressed nobles, many of whom had come purely for the entertainment of watching a peasant girl make a fool of herself, the conversations gradually died away. What happened next became one of the most documented and debated moments in medieval history. Without hesitation, Joan walked directly through the crowd to a young man who had deliberately dressed modestly and positioned himself among the lesser courtiers. She knelt before him and spoke the words that would echo through centuries. "Most noble Lord de Dauphin, I am Joan the Maid, and the King of Heaven sends you word by me that you will be anointed and crowned in the city of Reims, and you will be his lieutenant, the King of Heaven." Charles VII was 26 years old at the time of this first meeting, but his experiences had aged him beyond his years. He had spent most of his adult life watching his inheritance slip away, his armies defeated, his nobles defecting to the enemy. The Treaty of Troyes had declared him illegitimate, and there were moments when he himself wondered whether God had truly abandoned his cause. He was not physically impressive. Contemporary accounts describe him as slight of build, with a large nose and small eyes, but he possessed a quick intelligence and a desperate hunger for any sign that his fortunes might change. Joan's immediate identification of him, despite his disguise, was impressive. But what happened during their private conversation afterward was truly extraordinary. Charles later told his confessor that Joan had revealed to him details of a secret prayer he had made while alone in his private chapel, a prayer in which he had begged God to let him flee to Scotland or Spain if he were not truly the rightful king of France. No human being had been present to overhear this prayer, yet Joan repeated it back to him word for word. The content of this private conversation has been preserved through multiple sources, including Charles's own later testimony. Joan apparently told him that his legitimacy had been confirmed by divine revelation, and that his self-doubts were the result of enemy propaganda rather than genuine uncertainty about his parentage. More importantly, she outlined a specific plan for reversing French fortunes. She would raise the siege of Orléans, escort him to Reims for his coronation, and drive the English from France entirely. Charles's initial reaction was cautious. He had heard similar promises from other advisors and seen them come to nothing. What made Joan different was not just her claims of divine inspiration, but her detailed knowledge of military and political situations that a peasant girl should not have possessed. She described the disposition of English forces around Orléans, analyzed the strategic implications of various diplomatic initiatives, and demonstrated an understanding of court politics that impressed even experienced nobles. Still, the stakes were too high for Charles to act on faith alone. If Joan were a fraud, supporting her could destroy what remained of his credibility. If she were genuinely inspired by God, but politically naive, her failure might deal a final blow to French morale. If she were actually working for the enemy, a possibility that several courtiers suggested, providing her with military authority could result in catastrophic betrayal. The solution was to subject Joan to the most rigorous examination possible, while simultaneously preparing to exploit any opportunity her presence might create. Charles ordered that she be housed comfortably, but under careful guard, while a commission of theologians and lawyers investigated her claims. This examination, conducted at Poitiers over several weeks in March and April 1429, would determine whether Joan received official support for her mission. The Poitiers Commission included some of the most learned clerics and scholars available to Charles's government. Its members had experience in distinguishing between genuine religious phenomena and various forms of fraud, delusion, or diabolic influence. They were also politically sophisticated enough to understand the implications of their decision for the broader war effort. Joan's examination at Poitiers reveals both her intelligence and her growing confidence in dealing with authority figures. Rather than simply recounting her visions, she engaged her interrogators in theological debate, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of Christian doctrine despite her lack of formal education. When asked for a sign to prove her divine mission, she reportedly responded, "I did not come to Poitiers to perform signs. Take me to Orléans, and I will show you the signs for which I was sent." This response was strategically brilliant. Joan avoided the trap of attempting to produce miraculous phenomena on demand, something that would have exposed her to charges of fraud if she failed, or sorcery if she succeeded. Instead, she reframed the question in terms of practical action, challenging her examiners to judge her by results rather than supernatural demonstrations. The commissioners also investigated Joan's background, sending agents to Domremy to interview her family, neighbors, and local clergy. The reports they received were consistently positive. Joan came from a respectable family, had shown exceptional piety from childhood, had no history of heretical beliefs or suspicious activities. Local clergy testified that her devotion was genuine and that she had never displayed any interest in the occult practices sometimes associated with false prophets. Perhaps most importantly, the examination revealed no evidence of the pride, ambition, or worldly desires that medieval theologians associated with diabolic inspiration. Joan consistently denied personal credit for her mission, insisting that she was merely God's instrument. She showed no interest in personal enrichment or advancement, asking only for the resources necessary to accomplish her military objectives. When questioned about her ultimate goals, she spoke not of conquest or revenge, but of peace and the restoration of rightful authority. The commissioner's final report, delivered in early April, concluded that while Joan's claims could not be definitively verified, they appeared consistent with Orthodox Christian belief and posed no apparent danger to church doctrine. More significantly, the report suggested that given France's desperate situation, the potential benefits of supporting Joan outweighed the risks of opposing someone who might genuinely be God's messenger. This qualified endorsement was exactly what Charles needed to justify taking a calculated risk. Even if Joan's divine mission proved illusory, her presence had already generated unprecedented excitement among his supporters. Common people throughout his territories were interpreting her appearance as a sign that God had not abandoned France. Volunteers were arriving at Chinon from across the kingdom, eager to serve under the banner of the girl who claimed to speak with angels. More practically, Joan's proposals for relieving Orléans addressed genuine strategic necessities. The siege had reached a critical stage, and conventional attempts at relief had failed repeatedly. Joan's plan to attack the English siege lines directly, rather than attempting to sneak supplies into the city, was risky, but potentially more effective than the cautious approaches that had been tried before. Charles's decision to support Joan was influenced by one final consideration. He had nothing left to lose. His military situation was hopeless, his diplomatic options exhausted, his treasury nearly empty. Even if Joan's mission ended in failure, it could hardly make his position worse than it already was. And if she succeeded, if God had truly chosen to save France through this extraordinary instrument, the rewards would be beyond calculation. In mid-April 1429, Charles announced his decision to provide Joan with the resources she had requested. She would be given command of a relief force bound for Orléans, equipped with the finest arms and armor the royal treasury could afford, and supported by several of the kingdom's most experienced military commanders. To emphasize the religious significance of her mission, Charles also arranged for a special banner to be prepared bearing the sacred names of Jesus and Mary. Joan's reaction to this news reveals another facet of her complex character. Rather than showing triumph or satisfaction at achieving her initial goal, she immediately began planning the next phases of her campaign. She requested specific types of equipment, outlined her requirements for the composition of her army, and insisted on strict moral discipline among the troops who would serve under her command. Most significantly, Joan began to transform herself from a messenger claiming divine inspiration into a military commander prepared to lead troops in battle. She spent hours practicing with sword and lance, learning to manage her warhorse while wearing full armor, and studying the tactical challenges she would face at Orléans. Her natural athletic ability, combined with intensive training, allowed her to master these skills with remarkable speed. Joan also refined her public persona during this period, developing the combination of religious devotion and martial confidence that would make her such an effective leader. She attended Mass daily, spent long periods in prayer, and maintained the strict moral standards that had impressed her examiners at Poitiers. But she also cultivated an aura of military authority, speaking with confidence about strategy and tactics, while carrying weapons that she clearly knew how to use. The most famous artifact associated with this period was Joan's sword, which she claimed had been revealed to her by her voices. According to her instructions, the weapon was found buried behind the altar at the church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, exactly where she had predicted. The sword was ancient and covered with rust, but when cleaned, it revealed 5 crosses etched into the blade. Whether this discovery represented genuine divine revelation or careful advance planning by Joan's supporters has never been definitively determined, but its psychological impact was enormous. By late April 1429, Joan had completed her transformation from peasant girl to military commander. She wore custom-fitted armor that had cost the royal treasury 100 écus, roughly equivalent to 2 years' wages for a skilled craftsman. Her equipment included not just weapons and protective gear, but all the accessories of noble status: banners, standards, a household of servants and attendants, and horses worthy of a knight's dignity. More importantly, she had assembled a formidable military force for the relief of Orléans. The army that gathered at Blois under her nominal command included approximately 4,000 men-at-arms, supported by artillery, engineers, and substantial quantities of supplies for the besieged city. The troops included both volunteers inspired by Joan's religious message and seasoned professionals attracted by the prospect of French victory. The force was led by some of France's most capable military commanders. Jean Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, would coordinate with Joan's relief efforts from inside the besieged city. Gilles de Rais, a wealthy nobleman who would later achieve dark notoriety, provided both financial support and military expertise. La Hire and Poton de Xaintrailles, 2 of the kingdom's most feared warriors, agreed to serve under Joan's banner, Despite their initial skepticism about taking orders from a peasant girl, as Joan prepared to march from Blois to Orléans in late April 1429, she had already achieved something that many contemporaries considered impossible. She had convinced the court of Charles VII to stake the kingdom's survival on the divine mission of an illiterate peasant girl. Whether this remarkable gamble would succeed or fail remained to be seen, but Joan had demonstrated that in desperate times, extraordinary solutions could find acceptance even among the most sophisticated political minds. The relief of Orléans would be the test that determined whether Joan of Arc was truly God's chosen instrument for saving France, or merely another in the long series of false prophets who had promised deliverance and delivered only disappointment. The stakes could not have been higher. If Joan succeeded, Charles VII would be restored to his throne and France rescued from foreign occupation. If she failed, the Armagnac cause would collapse entirely, and the dream of French independence would die with the girl who had claimed to hear the voices of angels. As her army prepared to march toward what would become one of the most decisive battles in European history, Joan of Arc stood at the pinnacle of her extraordinary rise from peasant girl to national savior. In less than 4 months, she had traveled from the sheep pastures of Domremy to the command tent of a royal army. The greater journey, from obscurity to immortality, was about to begin. The clatter of armor and weapons echoed through the streets of Blois as Joan's army prepared for the march to Orléans. But the sounds that would instruct any experienced soldier as most remarkable were not those of military preparation. They were the sounds of prayer, confession, and hymn singing that rose from the camps as Joan transformed a traditional medieval army into something resembling a religious crusade. From the moment she assumed command, Joan instituted reforms that shocked both her soldiers and her enemies. No army in living memory had been subjected to such rigorous moral discipline. Joan banished prostitutes from the camp, forbade gambling and excessive drinking, and required all soldiers to attend Mass and make confession before engaging the enemy. She threatened to abandon any man who took God's name in vain, and her famous temper flared whenever she encountered blasphemy or immoral behavior among her troops. The legendary warrior La Hire, a grizzled Gascon mercenary known for his colorful profanity, found himself struggling to modify his habitual speech patterns to meet Joan's standards. The best he could manage was a compromise prayer that became famous throughout the army. God, I pray you that you will do for La Hire what La Hire would do for you if he were God and you were La Hire. Joan apparently accepted this unorthodox devotion as genuine, recognizing that spiritual transformation could not be accomplished overnight. More significantly, Joan's moral reforms were accompanied by a transformation in the army's sense of purpose and identity. These were no longer mercenaries fighting for pay or nobles pursuing personal glory, but soldiers of Christ engaged in a holy war to restore God's chosen king to his rightful throne. The psychological impact of this religious mission cannot be overstated. It gave French forces a sense of righteousness and divine protection that had been absent from their earlier campaigns. Joan's personal equipment during this period reflected her unique position as both warrior and mystic. Her armor, crafted by the finest artisans Charles VII could employ, was functional military gear designed for serious combat. But it was also symbolic of her divine mission, Contemporary accounts describe it as white harness, polished steel without decorative elements that proclaimed both her martial readiness and her spiritual purity. More famous than her armor was Joan's banner, perhaps the most recognizable symbol of her entire career. The banner bore the sacred names of Jesus and Mary, surrounded by images of angels, presenting a fleur-de-lis to God the Father. Joan herself described its significance. "I loved my banner 40 times better than my sword, and when I went against my enemy, I carried my banner myself, lest I kill any. I have never killed a man." This statement reveals a crucial aspect of Joan's military role that is often misunderstood. She was not primarily a combat soldier, but a commander and inspirational figure. Her function was to provide strategic direction, boost morale, and serve as a visible symbol of divine favor, rather than to engage in personal combat. The banner allowed her to fulfill this role while avoiding the moral complications that would arise from directly shedding blood. Joan's famous sword, from Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, was likewise more symbolic than practical. According to her testimony, her voices had directed her to this specific weapon, which was found buried behind the church altar, exactly where she had predicted. The sword's 5 crosses and its miraculous discovery became powerful propaganda tools, convincing many that Joan's mission was indeed divinely ordained. But beyond these symbolic weapons, Joan's true arsenal was her extraordinary ability to inspire confidence and devotion among her followers. She possessed what medieval people called charisma, literally gift of grace, that enabled her to command loyalty and obedience from men who had never before taken orders from a woman, much less a peasant. Part of this charisma came from Joan's evident sincerity and moral authority. Her soldiers could see that she lived by the same rigorous standards she demanded of them. She slept fully armored, ate simple food, refused personal comforts, and spent hours each day in prayer and religious observance. This was not a leader who demanded sacrifice from others while living in luxury herself. More importantly, Joan demonstrated practical military competence that complemented her spiritual authority. Despite her lack of formal training, she possessed an intuitive understanding of tactics and strategy that impressed even experienced commanders. She grasped immediately the importance of artillery and siege warfare, understood how to coordinate different types of troops in complex operations, and showed remarkable skill at reading enemy intentions and responding to changing battlefield conditions. Joan's military insights reflected both natural intelligence and divine inspiration, at least from her own perspective. She claimed that her voices provided specific tactical guidance, warning her of enemy movements, advising her on the timing of attacks, and even alerting her to personal dangers. Whether these insights came from supernatural sources or from Joan's own subconscious processing of military intelligence, they proved consistently accurate and valuable. The march from Blois to Orléans covered approximately 60 miles through territory that was theoretically controlled by French forces, but practically infested with English raiding parties and bandit groups. Joan's army moved slowly, burdened by supply wagons and artillery pieces that were essential for breaking the siege but difficult to transport over medieval roads. The journey took 3 days, during which Joan had ample opportunity to observe her troops and refine her command techniques. One incident from this march illustrates Joan's growing confidence and authority. When the army reached the Loire River, some commanders suggested crossing downstream from Orléans to avoid English positions. Joan overruled them, insisting that they cross directly opposite the city where their arrival would provide maximum encouragement to the besieged population. This decision required the troops to run a gauntlet of English artillery, but Joan's instinct for psychological warfare proved correct. The sight of relief forces arriving gave the defenders of Orléans new hope and determination. The military situation at Orléans in late April 1429 was complex and dangerous. The English had been besieging the city since October 1428, gradually tightening their grip through a series of fortified positions called bastilles that controlled access to the city from various directions. The siege was not a complete blockade. Supplies and reinforcements could still reach Orléans through gaps in the English lines. But the pressure was gradually strangling the city's ability to resist. Inside Orléans, the situation was becoming desperate. Food supplies were dwindling. Disease was spreading among the crowded population, and morale was collapsing as month after month passed without effective relief. The city's commander, Jean Dunois, had sent increasingly urgent appeals to Charles VII, but previous relief efforts had accomplished little beyond delivering supplies that barely kept the population alive. The English siege strategy reflected the evolution of medieval warfare during the Hundred Years' War. Rather than attempting costly direct assaults on Orléans' strong walls, they had adopted a patient approach designed to force surrender through starvation and disease. This strategy had proven effective in earlier sieges and seemed likely to succeed again, given the French inability to mount effective relief operations. The English forces around Orléans included some of the most experienced commanders and toughest soldiers in medieval Europe. The overall commander, the Earl of Salisbury, had been killed early in the siege, but his successors, including William Glasdale, William de la Pole, and John Talbot, were seasoned professionals who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of their position. They commanded approximately 5,000 troops, well positioned in fortified camps that could support each other against French attacks. More significantly, the English enjoyed significant advantages in morale and resources. Their recent string of victories had convinced many observers that God favored their cause, while French failures seemed to confirm that divine judgment had turned against the Armagnac faction. The English also had secure supply lines extending back to their bases in Normandy and regular reinforcement by fresh troops from England. Against these advantages, Joan's relief force brought several crucial assets that previous French efforts had lacked. Most obviously, the army was larger and better equipped than earlier relief expeditions, reflecting Charles VII's decision to commit maximum resources to breaking the siege. The force included substantial artillery that would prove crucial in reducing English fortifications. But the most important advantage Joan brought to Orléans was psychological rather than material. Her arrival transformed the siege from a military operation into a cosmic struggle between divine favor and diabolic opposition. French troops, who had previously fought defensively and cautiously, now believed they were serving as instruments of God's will. English soldiers, conversely, found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural protection and guidance. The first test of these psychological factors came on April 29, 1429, when Joan's army reached the outskirts of Orléans. Rather than immediately attacking the English positions, Joan chose to enter the city first to coordinate her plans with Jean Dunois and assess the military situation firsthand. This decision required her to pass through English lines under cover of darkness, a dangerous operation that could have resulted in her capture before her mission truly began. Joan's entry into Orléans became one of the most celebrated moments of her career. Contemporary accounts describe crowds of citizens lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the maid who had come to save their city. Many wept with joy at seeing her banner and armor, interpreting her arrival as proof that God had not abandoned France. The psychological boost to civilian morale was immediate and dramatic. More importantly, Joan's first night in Orléans allowed her to complete her transformation from court celebrity to military commander. Meeting with Dunois and other defenders, she demonstrated detailed knowledge of English positions, accurate assessment of French strengths and weaknesses, and clear strategic thinking about how to break the siege. By dawn, even the most skeptical professional soldiers acknowledged that she possessed genuine military competence to complement her inspirational value. Joan's battle plan for relieving Orléans reflected both tactical sophistication and strategic audacity. Rather than attempting to sneak supplies into the city or engaging in limited skirmishing, she proposed direct assault on the English bastilles, beginning with the fortifications east of the city and working systematically around the siege lines. This approach was risky. Frontal attacks on fortified positions typically resulted in heavy casualties, but it offered the possibility of decisive results that could break the siege entirely. The plan also reflected Joan's understanding that the siege of Orléans had become more than a military operation. It was a test of divine favor that would determine the future of the entire war. Half measures and cautious approaches would not suffice. Only dramatic, complete victory could restore French confidence and convince wavering allies that God truly supported Charles VII's cause. As Joan prepared for her first major battle, she embodied contradictions that perfectly captured the complexity of her historical role. She was a teenage girl commanding seasoned warriors, a peasant giving orders to nobles, a mystic planning artillery bombardments. She claimed divine guidance while demonstrating practical military competence, demanded moral purity while preparing for the brutal realities of siege warfare. Most significantly, she represented hope in a situation that had seemed hopeless. The kingdom that had watched its armies defeated, its cities conquered, and its king humiliated, now had a champion who promised that God had not abandoned France. Whether this hope would prove justified or illusory would be determined in the battles ahead. But Joan had already accomplished something remarkable. She had convinced a demoralized nation that victory was possible. The stage was set for one of the most decisive sieges in European history. In the bastilles surrounding Orléans, English soldiers prepared to defend positions they considered impregnable. In the city itself, French defenders waited for the signal to join Joan's assault. And at the center of it all, a peasant girl who claimed to speak with angels prepared to stake her life and her mission on the outcome of the next few days. The relief of Orléans would determine not just the fate of one city, but the future of two kingdoms. As Joan donned her white armor and took up her sacred banner for the first time in actual combat, she was about to discover whether her voices had been truly divine or merely the delusions of a girl who had dared to dream of changing the world. Dawn broke gray and cold over Orléans on May 4th, 1429. But for the first time in 7 months, the defenders of the city looked east toward the sunrise. with something approaching hope. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who claimed to carry messages from God, had spent the night in prayer and planning, and now she prepared to test her divine mission against the military might of England. The English siege lines that surrounded Orleans represented some of the most sophisticated military engineering of the late medieval period. The besiegers had constructed a chain of fortified positions, bastilles, that controlled all major approaches to the city. These structures were not mere camps, but permanent fortifications, each capable of withstanding assault while providing artillery platforms to bombard both the city and any relief forces that might attempt to break the siege. Joan of Arc leading soldiers at the Siege of Orleans, illustrated by Frederick Theodore Leeks. The strongest of these positions was Les Tourelles, a fortified bridge complex that controlled access to Orleans from the south. Built on a stone bridge across the Loire River, Les Tourelles consisted of two massive towers connected by walls and protected by additional earthworks on both sides of the river. The English had spent months strengthening this position, and it was considered virtually impregnable by conventional assault. But Joan did not plan a conventional assault. Her strategy for breaking the siege reflected both divine inspiration and practical military intelligence. Rather than attacking the strongest English positions first, she would begin with the smaller bastilles, using early victories to build momentum and confidence among her troops. The psychological impact of success would be as important as the tactical advantages gained, because Joan understood that the siege of Orleans had become a contest of wills as much as a military operation. The first target was the Bastille of Saint-Lô, located east of the city and somewhat isolated from other English positions. This fortification controlled the road to Jargeau and served as an early warning post for English forces, but it was not heavily garrisoned and could potentially be overwhelmed by a determined assault. Joan's attack plan demonstrated her growing sophistication as a military commander. Rather than simply ordering a frontal charge, she coordinated a complex operation involving multiple columns attacking from different directions while artillery provided covering fire. Her forces included not just professional soldiers, but enthusiastic volunteers from Orleans itself, citizens who were eager to strike back at their tormentors after months of passive suffering. The assault began shortly after dawn with a thunderous artillery barrage that caught the English garrison completely by surprise. Joan had positioned her cannons, some of the most advanced artillery of the period, to concentrate fire on specific sections of the Bastille's walls, creating breaches through which her infantry could advance. This focused use of gunpowder weapons represented a tactical innovation that would influence siege warfare for centuries to come. As the cannon fire died away, Joan herself led the charge toward the breached walls of Saint-Lô. Contemporary accounts describe her as a figure of terrifying inspiration, her white armor gleaming in the morning light as she carried her sacred banner toward the enemy positions. Her presence seemed to transform ordinary soldiers into heroes, giving them the courage to scale walls and fight hand-to-hand with English defenders who had previously seemed invincible. The battle for Saint-Lô was brief, but brutal. The English garrison, numbering approximately 400 men, found themselves overwhelmed by French forces that attacked with unprecedented ferocity and coordination. Within 2 hours, the Bastille had fallen, its defenders killed or captured. Its strategic position in English hands for 6 months now restored to French control. The psychological impact of this victory extended far beyond its tactical significance. For months, the English had seemed untouchable, their positions too strong to assault, their soldiers too professional to defeat. Joan's capture of St. Lou proved that English fortifications could be breached and English troops overcome by determined French assault. The myth of invincibility that had protected English forces since Agincourt began to crumble. More importantly, the victory validated Joan's claims of divine guidance in the eyes of both soldiers and civilians. She had promised that God would grant victory to righteous French forces, and St. Lou seemed to confirm this prophecy. Volunteers flocked to join her army, while English forces found themselves facing enemies who believed they possessed supernatural protection. Joan's response to victory revealed another aspect of her complex character. Rather than celebrating the conquest of St. Lou, she wept when she saw the bodies of English soldiers killed in the assault. "I have great pity," she said, "for these men who died without confession." This compassion for fallen enemies, even in the moment of triumph, distinguished Joan from the conventional military leaders of her era. But compassion did not mean hesitation. Even as she mourned the English dead, Joan was planning the next phase of her campaign. The fall of St. Lou had created a gap in the English siege lines that could be exploited before enemy commanders had time to adjust their positions. Speed and momentum were crucial. The siege must be broken completely before English reinforcements could arrive or existing forces could regroup. The second day of Joan's offensive, May 5th, focused on the bastilles of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc and Les Augustins. Fortified positions on the south bank of the Loire River that protected the approaches to Les Tourelles. These positions were stronger than St. Lou and more heavily garrisoned, but they were also more isolated from mutual support by other English forces. Joan's assault on these positions demonstrated her growing tactical sophistication and her ability to adapt her methods to different military challenges. Rather than relying primarily on frontal attack, she coordinated river crossings that allowed French forces to approach the bastilles from unexpected directions. This amphibious operation required careful planning and execution, showing that Joan was not simply an inspirational figure but a competent military technician. The battle for Saint-Jean-le-Blanc showcased another innovation in Joan's military methods: the integration of artillery, infantry, and psychological warfare into coordinated operations. Her cannons began the assault by breaching the Bastille's walls, but rather than immediately ordering infantry charges, Joan first had her heralds deliver ultimatums to the English garrison, offering them the opportunity to withdraw peacefully. These ultimatums were not merely ceremonial gestures, but calculated psychological operations designed to undermine English morale. Joan's heralds proclaimed that God had condemned English occupation of France and that continued resistance would result in divine punishment. Some English soldiers, already shaken by the rapid fall of St. Lou, apparently took these warnings seriously and abandoned their positions before the assault began. When the French infantry finally advanced against Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, they found the position lightly defended and quickly overwhelmed the remaining English forces. This bloodless victory further enhanced Joan's reputation for supernatural guidance while conserving French strength for more challenging battles ahead. The capture of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc opened the way to Les Augustins, a larger and more formidable fortification that served as the outer defense for Les Tourelles itself. This position was too strong to be taken by the methods that had succeeded at the smaller bastilles. Joan would need to demonstrate both tactical innovation and personal courage if she hoped to continue her string of victories. The assault on Les Augustins began on May 6th with the heaviest artillery bombardment of the campaign. Joan had concentrated all her available cannons against this single target, recognizing that breaching its walls would require overwhelming firepower. The bombardment continued for hours, sending clouds of stone dust and smoke across the battlefield, while French forces prepared for the final assault. But when the attack began, it quickly encountered fierce resistance from English defenders who had learned from their earlier defeats. The garrison of Les Augustins, commanded by experienced officers and reinforced by troops withdrawn from other positions, fought with desperation of men who knew that defeat here might mean the collapse of the entire siege. Joan herself was wounded early in the assault when a crossbow bolt struck her between the neck and shoulder. The injury was serious enough to penetrate her armor and draw significant blood, causing her to withdraw from the immediate fighting while her companions bound the wound. For a few terrifying moments, French forces wavered as rumors spread that their inspired leader had been killed or critically injured. But Joan's response to her wound became one of the defining moments of her military career. Rather than allowing herself to be evacuated to safety, she had her injury dressed quickly and returned to the front lines, carrying her banner and encouraging her troops to continue the assault. Her reappearance on the battlefield, bloodied but unbowed, seemed to confirm divine protection and inspired French forces to renew their attack with even greater ferocity. The final phase of the battle for Les Augustins demonstrated Joan's ability to coordinate complex operations under extreme pressure. While her infantry engaged English forces at the main walls, she directed artillery fire against specific defensive positions and coordinated flanking movements that prevented English forces from mutual support. This level of tactical control required both natural military talent and intensive preparation that belied her supposed lack of formal training. By evening, Les Augustins had fallen to French assault, its garrison killed or captured. Its strategic position added to Joan's growing list of victories. More importantly, the fall of this Bastille left Les Tourelles isolated and vulnerable to attack. The keystone of English siege operations was now exposed to direct assault. But Joan's greatest test still lay ahead. Les Tourelles was not just another fortified position, but the heart of English strategy at Orléans. Its capture would break the siege entirely and open the road to further French advances. Its successful defense, conversely, might allow English forces to regroup and maintain their strategic position despite their recent losses. The final battle of the campaign began at dawn on May 7th, 1429, with an artillery bombardment that could be heard for miles around Orléans. Joan had positioned her cannons to concentrate fire on the landward approaches to Les Tourelles, while boats brought additional forces across the Loire to attack the position from the riverside. This combined arms assault represented the culmination of everything she had learned during her brief but intense military career. The assault on Les Tourelles became the most desperate and bloody battle of Joan's military career. English forces, commanded by William Glasdale and reinforced by their best available troops, fought with the courage of men who understood that defeat here meant the end of their hopes for conquering France. French forces, inspired by their recent victories and convinced of their divine mission, attacked with a ferocity that impressed even their enemies. Joan herself was again wounded during the assault, this time more seriously, when a crossbow bolt penetrated her foot. But as at Les Augustins, she refused to withdraw from the battle, instead having her standard planted at the foot of the walls where it could be seen by French forces throughout the assault. Her visible presence on the battlefield, despite her wounds, became a rallying point that maintained French momentum even during the bloodiest phases of the fighting. The turning point came when French artillery succeeded in breaching the walls of Les Tourelles at several points simultaneously. This created multiple avenues of attack that English forces could not defend effectively, allowing French infantry to gain footholds within the fortification itself. Hand-to-hand fighting raged through the towers and along the walls as both sides committed their final reserves to the crucial battle. William Glasdale, the English commander, died when the drawbridge connecting Les Tourelles to the main shore collapsed under the weight of men and equipment. His death demoralized English resistance and signaled the beginning of the end for their forces at Orléans. By evening, Les Tourelles was in French hands, its strategic position transformed from the cornerstone of English siege operations into a launching point for French recovery. The fall of Les Tourelles effectively ended the siege of Orléans. English forces in the remaining bastilles, recognizing that their position had become untenable, began withdrawing during the night of May 7th to 8th. By dawn, the siege lines that had strangled Orléans for 7 months were abandoned, their artillery pieces and supplies left behind in the haste of English retreat. Joan's victory at Orléans was complete and decisive. In 4 days of fighting, she had transformed what seemed like an impossible military situation into a stunning French triumph. The city that had been on the verge of surrender was now free, its population celebrating in the streets as church bells rang out across the Loire Valley. But the strategic implications of the victory extended far beyond the liberation of a single city. The siege of Orléans had been the cornerstone of English strategy in France, the operation that would have opened the Loire Valley to complete conquest and forced Charles VII's final surrender. Joan's successful defense of the city preserved Charles's kingdom and created the foundation for French recovery. More significantly, the manner of Joan's victory transformed the psychological dynamics of the 100 Years' War. English forces that had seemed invincible since Agincourt were now in full retreat, their professional soldiers defeated by a peasant girl who claimed divine guidance. French forces that had been demoralized by decades of defeat were now confident and aggressive, eager to continue their offensive against enemy positions throughout the Loire Valley. Joan herself emerged from Orléans as more than a successful military commander. She had become a symbol of French resistance and divine favor, a figure whose very presence on the battlefield seemed to guarantee victory. Volunteers flocked to join her army from throughout Charles's territories, while English forces found themselves facing enemies who believed they possessed supernatural protection. The 7 days of fighting that broke the siege of Orléans had indeed shaken 2 kingdoms. France, which had seemed doomed to foreign conquest and political dissolution, was now resurgent and confident. England, which had appeared destined to complete the subjugation of its ancient rival, found its centuries-long dream of dual monarchy slipping away. As Joan rode through the liberated streets of Orléans on May 8th, her white armor gleaming in the spring sunlight as grateful citizens threw flowers in her path. She had accomplished the first phase of her mission. Her voices had promised that she would raise the siege of the city, and that promise had been fulfilled through a combination of divine guidance, military competence, and sheer determination. But this was only the beginning. The next phase of Joan's mission, escorting Charles VII to Rennes for his coronation, would require not just military victories, but a complete transformation of the strategic balance in France. The peasant girl who had saved Orléans would now have to liberate a kingdom. The liberation of Orléans had given France something it had not possessed for decades: momentum. As news of Joan's miraculous victory spread throughout the kingdom, a transformation began that went far beyond military considerations. French nobles who had remained neutral suddenly declared for Charles VII. Towns that had submitted to English rule began to waver in their loyalty. Most importantly, common people throughout France began to believe that God had indeed sent a deliverer to restore their rightful king. Joan understood that momentum was a fragile thing that required constant nurturing through continued success. She could not afford to rest on her victory at Orléans or allow English forces time to regroup and adapt to the new strategic situation. The logic of her divine mission demanded immediate action to capitalize on the psychological advantages her triumph had created. Her strategic objective was clear. She must clear English forces from the Loire Valley and secure a safe corridor for Charles VII's journey to Reims, where he would be crowned king in the cathedral that had witnessed the consecration of French monarchs for 8 centuries. This coronation was not merely ceremonial but politically essential. Until Charles was anointed with the sacred cream at Reims, his legitimacy remained questionable and his authority incomplete. The English response to their defeat at Orléans revealed both their military professionalism and their growing psychological disadvantage. Rather than attempting to retake the city immediately, they withdrew to their remaining strongholds in the Loire Valley and prepared for a coordinated defense of their territorial holdings. Their strategy was sound. By forcing Joan to attack prepared positions rather than conducting sieges themselves, they hoped to negate the inspirational advantages that had proven so decisive at Orléans. The first major engagement of what historians call the Loire Campaign came at Jargeau, a fortified town roughly 12 miles east of Orléans. The English garrison there, commanded by the Duke of Suffolk, had been reinforced since the fall of Orléans and occupied positions that seemed capable of withstanding extended siege. More importantly, the town's location controlled the road network that Joan would need to use for her advance toward Reims. Joan's assault on Jargeau demonstrated both her growing tactical sophistication and her ability to adapt her methods to different military challenges. Rather than relying primarily on inspiration and frontal assault, she employed a combination of psychological warfare, artillery bombardment, and coordinated infantry attacks that reflected genuine military competence. The siege began on June 11th, 1429, with Joan's now customary demand for the garrison's surrender. Her heralds delivered ultimatums that combined political arguments with religious appeals, proclaiming that God had commanded English withdrawal from France and warning of divine punishment for continued resistance. These psychological operations were not merely ceremonial but calculated efforts to undermine enemy morale and encourage defection. When the English refused to surrender, Joan began systematic artillery bombardment of Jargeau's walls. Her cannons, now supplemented by guns captured at Orléans, represented some of the most advanced siege equipment of the period. More importantly, Joan had learned to coordinate her artillery with other elements of her forces, using cannon fire not just to breach walls, but to suppress enemy counterfire and provide cover for infantry advances. The assault itself showcased Joan's personal courage and her growing reputation among her troops. When French forces hesitated before the final attack on Jargeau's breached walls, Joan herself climbed a siege ladder and planted her banner on the town's ramparts. This act of conspicuous bravery rallied her soldiers and convinced them that their leader was indeed protected by divine favor. The fall of Jargeau on June 12th resulted in another complete French victory. The Duke of Suffolk was captured along with most of his garrison, providing Charles VII with valuable prisoners for exchange negotiations, while eliminating another key English position in the Loire Valley. More significantly, the rapid success at Jargeau demonstrated that Joan's victory at Orléans was not a fluke, but evidence of a fundamental shift in military capabilities. Joan's treatment of captured English forces at Jargeau revealed both her practical intelligence and her consistent moral principles. Rather than allowing her soldiers to massacre prisoners or hold them for individual ransom, she insisted that captured enemies be treated according to Christian principles and used for broader strategic purposes. The Duke of Suffolk, as a prisoner of high rank, would eventually be exchanged for French nobles held by the English, while common soldiers were often released after taking oaths not to fight against France for specified periods. This policy toward prisoners served multiple purposes beyond moral considerations. By treating captured enemies with unexpected mercy, Joan encouraged English soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, reducing casualties on both sides while speeding the capture of enemy positions. Her reputation for honoring the laws of war also helped convince neutral observers that French forces had become more disciplined and effective than their English counterparts. The next target in Joan's campaign was Meung-sur-Loire, a smaller but strategically important town that controlled a bridge across the Loire River. The English garrison there, warned by messengers from Jargeau, had prepared extensive defenses and received reinforcements from other positions in the valley. But they also faced a French force that was growing larger and more confident with each victory. The siege of Meung-sur-Loire illustrated Joan's developing understanding of operational warfare, the coordination of multiple battles within a broader strategic framework. Rather than treating each engagement as an isolated event, she began planning sequences of operations designed to achieve cumulative effects that would be greater than the sum of individual victories. Her approach to Meung-sur-Loire demonstrated this strategic thinking. Instead of conducting a lengthy siege that would give English forces time to coordinate their response, Joan opted for a rapid assault designed to capture the town's bridge and move on to the next target before enemy commanders could adapt to her methods. This operational tempo kept English forces off balance and prevented them from developing effective countermeasures to French advances. The assault on Meung-sur-Loire began on June 15th, with coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Joan had learned to use her growing army's size to her advantage, deploying different columns to threaten various parts of the English defenses simultaneously. This forced enemy commanders to divide their attention and resources, weakening their ability to concentrate resistance at any single point. The town fell to French assault after less than 2 days of fighting, its garrison killed or scattered, and its strategic bridge captured intact. The speed of this victory was remarkable, even by the standards Joan had established at Orléans and Jargeau, and it demonstrated that French forces were becoming more effective with experience, while English resistance was beginning to weaken under the pressure of repeated defeats. But Joan's greatest triumph during the Loire campaign came at the Battle of Patay on June 18th, 1429, an engagement that would prove to be one of the most decisive battles of the 100 Years' War. Unlike her previous victories, which had been sieges of fortified positions, Patay was a meeting engagement between two armies in open field, exactly the kind of battle where English forces had traditionally held overwhelming advantages. The battle developed when Joan's advance guard, commanded by La Hire and Potin de Xaintrailles, encountered English forces under Sir John Fastolf and John Talbot, who were attempting to retreat toward their bases in Normandy. The English commanders, recognizing their disadvantageous position, attempted to establish hasty defensive positions using the tactics that had proven successful at Agincourt and other battles during the 100 Years' War. But the psychological factors that had worked in England's favor at Agincourt now favored France at Patay. English soldiers, who had once been confident of victory, now faced enemies who believed themselves divinely protected. French forces that had previously been cautious and defensive now attacked with unprecedented aggression and coordination. Joan herself did not participate directly in the fighting at Patay. She arrived on the battlefield only after the main action had concluded, but her influence on the battle was decisive nonetheless. The French cavalry that shattered English formations had been inspired by her presence and motivated by her promise of divine protection. The coordination between different French units reflected tactical principles she had developed during her siege campaigns. The results of Patay were catastrophic for English forces. John Talbot, one of England's most experienced commanders, was captured along with most of his army. English casualties numbered in the thousands, while French losses were minimal. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that French forces could now defeat English armies even in open field engagements, where their enemies held traditional advantages. The psychological impact of Patay extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. English forces throughout France now faced enemies who had proven themselves capable of victory under any circumstances. The myth of English military superiority, carefully cultivated since the early victories of the 100 Years' War, lay in ruins on the battlefield of Patay. Joan's response to her triumph at Patay revealed once again her complex relationship with the violence that seemed necessary to achieve her divine mission. When she saw John Talbot, the captured English commander, she reportedly told him, "You did not think this morning that this would happen to you." But she also ensured that he and other prisoners were treated with courtesy and provided with medical care for their wounds. This combination of military effectiveness and moral restraint distinguished Joan from many of her contemporaries and helped explain her growing influence among French forces. Her soldiers fought more effectively because they believed in both her tactical competence and her spiritual authority, while her enemies found themselves increasingly demoralized by defeats inflicted by an army that seemed to fight according to higher moral standards than they were accustomed to experiencing. The string of French victories during the Loire campaign, Orléans, Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, Patay, had transformed the strategic situation in France more dramatically than anyone could have predicted. Joan of Arc's life encompasses themes that remain profoundly relevant. The power of individual conviction, the relationship between spirituality and political action, the challenge of transcending social boundaries, and the complex nature of historical memory. From a 13th century peasant girl experiencing divine visions to a military leader who changed the course of European history, her story defies simple categorization. Whether viewed through the lens of faith, psychology, feminism, or nationalism, Joan of Arc continues to inspire and provoke. Her legacy as saint, heroine, and symbol demonstrates how extraordinary individuals can indeed alter history's trajectory through unwavering commitment to their beliefs. In an age of cynicism and doubt, Joan's absolute certainty in her divine mission offers a compelling reminder of conviction's transformative power, regardless of how one interprets the source of that conviction. Her influence extends far beyond medieval France, providing a template for resistance movements, a symbol for women's empowerment, and a reminder that the most unlikely people can emerge as history's most consequential figures. Joan of Arc remains not just a historical curiosity, but a living symbol whose story continues to evolve with each generation's reinterpretation of her remarkable life and enduring legacy.